In 1943, something unexpected began to happen. Not on the battlefield, not in the skies over Europe, but thousands of miles away, inside the United States. German soldiers, captured in North Africa, hardened by war, loyal to everything they had been taught to believe, were about to experience something that would change them forever. They arrived expecting weakness. They arrived expecting division. They arrived expecting a country that could not sustain a long war. Instead, they found something else entirely. They found abundance. They found cities that glowed at night while Europe sat in darkness. They found farms so vast they stretched beyond anything they had ever imagined. They found factories that did not slow down, did not struggle, did not stop. And slowly, quietly, their understanding of the war began to break. These were not just prisoners of war. They were witnesses. Witnesses to something that no propaganda could hide: the true scale of American power. When the first German prisoners arrived in the United States, many of them were veterans of the Africa Corps, experienced soldiers, disciplined, confident. They had been told that America was weak, that its people were soft, that its industry was unorganized. They believed it, because that is what they had been taught. But belief does not survive contact with reality, and reality was waiting for them. They were transported across the Atlantic, not to ruins, not to ration lines, not to a nation struggling to survive, but to a country that seemed untouched by war. Trains moved constantly, goods flowed freely, food was abundant. For many of these prisoners, it was the first crack in everything they thought they knew. Because in Germany, resources were limited, food was rationed, cities were under constant threat. But here, there was no shortage. Meals were regular, conditions were stable, and in some cases, life inside the camps was more predictable than life they had left behind. This was not what they expected, and that difference began to matter. Across the United States, hundreds of prisoner-of-war camps were established, from rural farmland to small towns to open fields far from major cities. The prisoners were distributed across the country, separated from the war, but not from its consequences. They worked, they observed, they listened, and what they saw could not be explained by the ideology they once believed in. Factories operated at a scale they had never imagined. Production did not happen slowly. It did not depend on scarcity. It happened continuously, relentlessly. American industry did not simply support the war, it overwhelmed it. There are accounts from prisoners who were taken past industrial facilities and could not understand what they were seeing. Buildings that stretched for miles, machines that never stopped, workers who moved with purpose but without fear, and output that seemed impossible. Aircraft produced in hours, vehicles produced in numbers that defied logic, supplies that moved without interruption. For men who came from a system built on control and limitation, this was something entirely different. It was freedom, and it was power. But the transformation did not happen all at once. At first, many resisted. They held on to their beliefs. They repeated what they had been taught. They spoke of superiority, of destiny, of victory. But slowly, those ideas began to weaken. Not because they were told they were wrong, but because they could see it with their own eyes. They saw American workers not as oppressed, but as individuals. They saw diversity, different backgrounds, different languages, different lives working together, and yet producing more than anything they had known. This was not supposed to be possible, because everything they had believed told them it wasn't, and yet there it was, real, undeniable. For some prisoners, the change was subtle, a question here, a doubt there. For others, it was immediate, a realization that something was deeply wrong with everything they had been told. And once that realization begins, it does not stop, because truth has a way of spreading, not through force, but through evidence. Inside the camps, information moved quietly. conversations at night, observations during work, moments of reflection when no one was watching. And over time, those conversations changed. They became less about loyalty and more about understanding, less about certainty and more about doubt. And in that doubt, something new began to form. Not fear, but awareness. An awareness that the war was not what they thought it was, that the enemy was not what they had been told, and that the world was far larger than the one they had known. This was not re-education through force. There were no loud speeches, no constant pressure, no visible campaign. Instead, there was something far more powerful: exposure. Exposure to a different way of life, a different system, a different reality. And for many of these prisoners, that exposure was enough. Because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. And once you begin to question, you cannot return to certainty. By the end of their first months in America, many German prisoners were no longer the same men who had arrived. They still wore the same uniforms, they still carried the same memories, but inside, something had shifted. And that shift would have consequences far beyond the camps themselves. As the months passed, the transformation became impossible to ignore. What began as small doubts, quiet questions, private thoughts, was turning into something deeper, a shift in identity. Because for many of these prisoners, this was the first time they were exposed to a world beyond control. A world where people spoke freely, where workers were not driven by fear, but by opportunity. And that difference began to reshape everything. Inside the camps, life followed a structure. There were rules, schedules, responsibilities, but there was also something unexpected: stability. The prisoners were fed, they were housed, they were treated according to international standards, and in many cases, they were given work. Work that was not forced through brutality, but organized. Some worked on farms, others helped in small industries, some assisted in infrastructure and local labor. And through that work, they saw something they had never experienced before: productivity without fear. American workers did not operate under constant threat. They were not driven by punishment. They were driven by purpose. And that idea was difficult to understand at first, because everything these soldiers had known told them that strength came from control. But here, they were witnessing something else: strength through freedom. And it worked. The scale of American production became one of the most powerful forces in this transformation. Factories did not slow down. They did not pause. They did not struggle to meet demand. They exceeded it. There are accounts from prisoners who described seeing entire assembly lines producing aircraft components faster than they believed possible. Materials moved without delay. Machines operated continuously. Workers remained consistent, and the output was overwhelming. It was not just the speed, it was the consistency, the ability to produce again and again without collapse. For soldiers who came from a system where shortages were common, this was something beyond comprehension. And slowly, the conclusion became unavoidable. This was a war that could not be won, not against a nation like this. But the transformation was not only industrial, it was personal. Inside the camps, programs began to appear: subtle, structured, not designed to force change, but to encourage thought. Books were introduced, newspapers were available, information filtered but present. Discussions began. At first, they were cautious. Some prisoners remained loyal to the ideology they had followed. They resisted. They rejected new ideas, but others began to listen, and listening led to thinking, and thinking led to change. Over time, groups began to form, not around loyalty to the past, but around curiosity about the future. What would happen after the war? What kind of world would remain? What role would they have in it? These questions began to matter more than old beliefs, and with those questions came something unexpected: responsibility. Because for the first time, many of these men began to see themselves not just as soldiers, but as individuals, capable of choice, capable of change. And that realization was powerful, because it meant that everything they had followed was not inevitable. It had been chosen, and what is chosen can be changed. This shift did not happen to everyone. Some resisted until the end. Some held on to their beliefs, even when faced with undeniable reality. But many did not. Many began to move away from the ideology they once defended, not through force, not through fear, but through observation. They had seen a different system, a different society, and they could not ignore the difference. One of the most striking aspects of this transformation was how little resistance there was in the form of escape attempts. Despite being held far from home, in a foreign land, with opportunities that might have allowed escape, very few tried. Because for many, escape no longer made sense. Where would they go? What would they return to? A country at war? A system under pressure? A reality that no longer aligned with what they had seen? And so, they stayed, not just because they had to, but because they were beginning to understand something. That the war was not just being fought with weapons, it was being decided by systems, by production, by stability, by resilience. And in those areas, the United States was unmatched. This understanding spread, not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. And as it spread, it weakened something fundamental: belief. Because belief, when faced with truth, cannot remain unchanged. By the time the war in Europe began to approach its final stages, many of these prisoners were no longer the same men that had arrived years before. They had seen too much, understood too much, questioned too much. And once that process begins, there is no returning to what came before. The transformation was not complete, but it was undeniable. And what came next would define its true impact.
As the war came to an end, the world that these men once knew was gone. Germany lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, a nation broken. For the prisoners who had spent years in the United States, this moment carried a different weight, because they were not returning as the same men who had left. They had seen something else. Something that did not collapse under pressure, something that did not depend on control, but on strength built from within. And now, they had to face what remained of their own country. When many of these former prisoners returned to Germany, they carried more than memories of war. They carried perspective. They had witnessed a system that functioned differently, a society that operated without constant fear, an economy that produced not through desperation, but through organization and scale. And that experience began to influence what came next. Germany needed to rebuild, not just its cities, but its identity. And in that process, these men became something unexpected, participants in change. Some would enter public life, others would work in administration. Some would contribute quietly, in ways history would never fully record. But their influence was there, in decisions, in conversations, in the direction the country would take, because they had seen an alternative. And once you see an alternative, you cannot ignore it. Among those who experienced this transformation were individuals who would later play roles in shaping post-war Europe. Men who had once worn the uniform of a collapsing regime, now contributing to systems built on cooperation, on stability, on democratic principles. This was not a sudden shift. It did not happen overnight, but it happened slowly, steadily, and it began not on the battlefield, but inside prison camps, places that were never meant to change the course of history. And yet, they did, because what happened there was something few expected: the defeat of an idea, not through destruction, not through force, but through exposure. Exposure to a system that worked, a society that produced, a nation that did not break under pressure. The United States was often called the arsenal of democracy, but that phrase meant more than weapons. It meant example, because what these prisoners saw was not just military power, it was the result of freedom applied at scale, and that was something no propaganda could defeat. The transformation of these men did not erase the past. It did not undo the war. It did not erase what had been done. But it created something new, a path forward, a possibility that did not exist before. And in that sense, one of the most important victories of the war was not won in combat, it was won in understanding. Because when belief changes, the future changes with it. For the United States, this was a different kind of strength, not just the ability to destroy, but the ability to influence, not just to defeat an enemy, but to reshape what comes after. And that may be the most lasting impact of all. The men who once arrived as prisoners left as something else, witnesses. Witnesses to a nation that proved its power not only through force, but through what it represented. And long after the war ended, that lesson remained. Because weapons can win battles, but ideas shape the world that follows. And in the end, that is where the true victory lies. This was not just a story of prisoners. It was a story of transformation, of what happens when reality replaces belief, when exposure replaces isolation, and when a nation proves that its strength is more than military, that it is built on something deeper, something that endures, something that others can see and choose to follow. This was a different kind of battlefield, and on this battlefield, America did not just win the war, it helped shape the peace. This was the story of German prisoners in America, and this was the voice of war.